Welcome to Just Theory. In this episode, we are speaking with Linda Zerilli, the Charles Merriam Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science at Chicago University, where she writes on subjects ranging from feminist thought to the politics of language, democratic theory, and continental philosophy. We discuss her reflections on Volume 1 of Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind, as well as the interplay between thinking, knowing, and judging. We ask why opinions matter, wonder about the role of individuals in assessing the legal system, and learn from feminist historiography. So, without further ado, I present you Episode 6 on bringing thinking down to earth.
Hi, Linda. Thank you so much for joining us. We are absolutely delighted to have you on our podcast. And we are very curious about how did you actually end up where you are at the moment in academia before we dive into your recent work on Hannah Arendt, Vita Contemplativa, and Hannah Arendt's ideas more broadly.
Certainly. Well, first, thanks very much for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not really sure how I ended up becoming a professor. I know that's probably not the answer you're supposed to give, but I really didn't, I didn't go to either undergraduate, I didn't get my BA or even my PhD with the idea of I'm going to become a professor and, I'm going to become a professor of political theory or political science even. I was always a political person, I suppose you could say, not always, but I became politicized at a fairly early age as a feminist. And then I went to Ithaca College where I studied with Sheila Eisenstein, and she had a very intense influence on me in terms of feminism. And then I went to Berkeley, where I, had the pleasure of studying with a number of different people. I can talk about them now, or I can talk about them later. But in any case, they, I really started to see the connections between studying, in particular, political theory and my interest in feminism. Although at the time that I was a graduate student, there weren't really feminist readings of the canon. I mean, there were some, like Susan Oken's book was out, Women in Western Political Thought, Jean Elstein's book, Public Man, Private Woman, but there wasn't a lot of work there. And so it was always very difficult for me to see how I could connect my interest in feminism with, the canon of political theory. And I think that was, in some respects, something of maybe an obstacle to thinking of myself as becoming a professor, because I was interested in feminism. But once I was able to make the link, thanks to, many people there who really helped me out, then I started imagining it. But life as a graduate student, when I was a graduate student, which is from 78 to 86, is different than it is now.
I wonder, it's very, very interesting what you said. And in a way, it connects to your concept of time and temporality in the first paper on feminism. Maybe I'm reading too much into this now, but I feel what you just said and how your life unfolded and your career unfolded is very much the same critical process which you describe in your work on feminism. So it's not simply I'm pursuing here my linear career.
Right.
Keep referring back to what's important to me, and life teaches me, so to say, where I'm going. So I'm not sure if we will unpack those ideas in a moment. But what did strike me quite from what you just said, that there is this kind of melting of horizons in your own path and in your own career, that the past informs the present and reaches out and projects itself into the future. Am I correct in that, or am I reading too much? Your life is actually informed by your philosophy.
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I agree with everything you just said there. I think, whenever you're asked about how you became this person, right, or how you chose, you're always reconstructing the past in a certain way. You're trying to find some meaning in the past that can connect what oftentimes are very just contingent, sort of, I don't know, just unconnected events in a way that creates a meaningful narrative. And so, and plus there's a lot of pressure, and I think there's a lot of pressure for graduate students today, to always seem to know what track they're on and who they're going to become. And they not only know what their dissertation topic is when they come into graduate school, they know exactly the kind of professor they want to be. And there's a lot of pressure like that. And so, I mean, yes, there is an interesting relationship to this temporality to, as we look back in the past, as I argue in that paper, which, we'll discuss, there's a tendency in feminism and there's a tendency in all history writing to create a kind of seamlessness of time that just didn't exist, but that's how we create meaning, right? For our own lives and also for the lives of people we study.
So I suppose this is how our consciousness is being shaped by contingent and sometimes random events, which then translates into what the meaning in life. That's what Hannah Arendt, Heidegger, they were interested in how meaning emerges from the stream of events. And I suppose that is true of any of us, any academics, that we are actually we are reflective individuals, and we try to take into account those events and take them and have them reflected in our actual life and careers. So perhaps Aleksandra.
Oh yeah, I'm just listening, fascinated, because I don't want us to move on too quickly from your paper on feminism, but I have to, purely because what you just said about learning really was my intuition when I was reading your paper on bring thinking down to earth. Because when both Arendt and yourself, when you talk about the idea of learning and knowing, or thinking and knowing, as not the privilege of the few, not the Platonic academy, but rather Socrates's agora, the almost duty of the many. This is also something that just provoked this thought in me, that we almost are not encouraged to learn. We don't have that love of learning, even academics. And it's perhaps a controversial thing to say, but I do believe that a lot of academics have lost over the years, even grad students like myself. We lose this sheer love of learning new things. The pleasure of thinking, or perhaps contemplating, we'll find out shortly. And it's very interesting because it does tie in with this very reflective practice as well.
I think that's definitely true. And I mean, I see it in myself as well. I think that there's a kind of instrumentalization of learning that we all sort of get pulled into and participate in. And what I mean by that is, well, why should I, spend a lot of time thinking about something that I could never write on? I'm not a specialist in that. This sense of being like having a certain kind of expertise, like that's what I do. I mean, I was even having a conversation with someone the other day. I won't go into all the details, but anyway, and she was asking me, and I said, well, yeah, but I don't do analytic. I don't do analytic feminist philosophy. Okay. I mean, I know it, but I don't do it. It's not my specialty. And then afterwards, I thought, what a silly thing to say. At some level, that's true. I haven't written things in analytic, feminist philosophy, but the idea that, what we're specialists in or becomes kind of blocks our ability or even our desire at a certain point to think about things that lie outside that specialty, and that's one of the real perils, if you like, certainly of becoming an academic, but of thinking about knowledge and thinking, in that way. And that's something that Arendt was absolutely against. She did not see herself that way. She thought about thinking in terms of just the need to understand, I mean, that's really how she thought about thinking. It's like how, I need to understand the world around me, and not with an instrumentalist view of then setting everything right, but just making sense for herself. So that's a long-winded answer. I agree with you. I think it's quite unfortunate, and I think it does lead to a sense of, there are the thinkers and the non-thinkers. There are the professional thinkers. For Arendt, they were the philosophers. They were Plato, his academy, and all those folks who shut themselves away from the many. But the same problem is reproduced today, where we have, the defense, for example, of academic freedom. Academics have to be able to think. They have to be in their little ivory tower and be able to think their radical thoughts. And, okay, fine. But how is that connected up with democracy and a practice of thinking on the part of all citizens, which we need to be able to expect from all citizens? It's a practice. That's all it is. It's just something you learn to do by doing it.
I wonder, we really touched upon two major themes in your work here. So the first one is obviously temporality and its connection to feminism. And the second one, we were exploring the notion, Hannah Arendt's notion of thinking and human condition more generally. So perhaps we could unpack those two streams in your work and begin with the feminism, and if you could tell us something about your project on feminism and temporality and historicity. How does it, what is the project all about?
Well, that project, which is still really in the, sort of baby stages, so to speak, comes out of, I taught a course at the University of Chicago 2 years ago called Feminism and the Radical Democratic Imaginary. And I was very interested in exploring the debates around, the waves metaphor being like that feminism is divided into these different waves. We have the first wave, which is essentially ends with the, struggle that is about the struggle for the female franchise, and then ends with the 19th Amendment, passage of the 19th Amendment. Then there's a kind of desert, and then we get into the 60s and we're in second wave feminism, eventually third, and then it's sort of, well, what wave are we in now? And a lot of feminists argue, well, we're in intersectional feminism. We're not, and some people will say maybe that's a fourth wave or whatever. But the critiques of the waves metaphors really made sense to me, in that it tends to treat feminism as almost having a kind of teleological development, like what comes later is by definition better. So, the second wave is better than the first wave, the third wave is better than the second, and so on. And this sense of being embedded then in a general Western narrative of progress, right? So the interesting part, or the interesting aspect of those critiques for me, is that they touched on a lot of things that are very familiar to me from my reading of people like Hannah Arendt, Walter Benjamin, Reinhard Koselleck. I mean, people who have really worked on this question of temporality and we shall call it the myth. I mean, Arendt doesn't just talk about it as a myth. I mean, for Arendt, the idea of progress is really a kind of an assault on the very notion of human freedom. And so looking at feminism in terms of those critiques, I became very interested in the development then of this idea of, well, we have to talk about the long women's movement. And by that, I mean, like, instead of just talking about the Declaration of Sentiments, the founding story of Western feminism, certainly in the United States, beginning in 1848 in Seneca Falls, and all of that. And the critique of that as being about white women's feminism and the rest. And I appreciate those critiques, and I think that basically they're right. However, a lot actually of what has developed out of the critique of this notion of the waves of feminism is what I call the sort of idea of the long women's movement. It's not I just call it, it's what these feminists, most of whom are historians, are trying to develop. So basically they want to say, look, there's a lot of stuff going on. It's not just about this, this kind of self-contained wave. You have to look at women's labor activism, anti-racist activism, pro-immigrant activism. Like there's lots of forms of activism that haven't counted as part of feminism that now should count as part of feminism. And we would then have what you would call a kind of long women's movement, instead of this idea that in 1920 it was all over and it didn't start again until the 60s and so on. You'd get more of a sense of this continuity, and you would make visible actors who had been rendered invisible in the waves, sort of version of feminism. And even though I find that a very important project, I think that historians who are doing that kind of work, it's incredibly important to unearth all of that. I've been very influenced by people, let's say like Saidiya Hartman, Marisa Fuentes, feminists who've worked, for example, on the history of slavery and have confronted the problem of the kind of, what do you do when the archive runs dry? Like, in other words, that they have had to come up against the problem of, do you keep digging and keep trying to fill out the archive? Or do you have to raise questions about the historical methodology that demands a certain form of evidence in order to produce a different understanding of history? And I could go on and on.
Yes,
so,
yes.
you should feel free to just like stop me here and then ask a different question, because
what I found absolutely remarkable here again is that you're not the first speaker on our podcast who challenges the linear conception of time, especially the Hegelian connection to progress and the idea that everything that comes later is better. So a number of our speakers actually said that this is in particular evident in areas such as law, which shows this commitment or apparent commitment to human rights, to progress, to improvement on surface. But when you unearth those most recent developments, it is often revealed that they need to be critically assessed before being taken for granted and before being taken in this kind of one interpretation is always right fashion. So I what I found very interesting from what you say, that across all our feminists, so to say, speakers here, they seem to be challenging that assumption. So it's more of an observation rather than a question. And
it's the same. Yeah, and it's the same with just people who do work in law these days or legal history. Mm-hmm. I think it's a very common position now to challenge the this almost linear the perspective on the linear evolution of the legal systems. So one of our guests presented a slightly alternative viewpoint on the history of the developmental law and the normative landscape. So what we would normally, if we asked anybody, and I actually did a little experiment asking a few of my friends how they think law developed, it's on a continent you're being taught that, it starts in Babylonia and then it goes to ancient Rome and then France and Austria and Germany. And then everybody lives a happy family, except for the US and the UK, because they have a different system. And it's developed in this very linear in this very linear fashion. But I think what we forget, it's a lot of it is a historical interpretation of past events, or it's finding patterns that may not have been there or may not have been put there intentionally by the people on the ground who were acting in a particular time, right? So a lot of this is a matter of our perspective. And I feel like there are groups in academia that were so successful in pushing this perspective through that we're almost losing the originality of the thought that was happening as things were happening on the ground.
So you're trying to suggest that we reconstructed and deconstructed the ideas to such an extent that we cannot even go back to the original idea. Is that something that Hannah Arendt would approve of in her concept of understanding, in her concept of challenging, so to say, the one single correct interpretation?
Okay, let me put it this way. I am very aware that there are a lot of critiques out there like this. I mean, feminists have been criticizing the progress narrative for a long time. There are many critiques of a teleological conception of history, not only in feminism, but in philosophy of history, et cetera, et cetera. So the question, though, for me has to do with how feminist historiography remains, despite its awareness of those problems, entangled in certain presuppositions of modern historiography that are problematic for political action in the present. So a lot of my focus is really on this idea of, following Foucault, history of the present, by which, he means, thinking about the past in terms of the present, not in terms of like, a sort of presentism, but rather thinking about trying to make sense of the present. There's an assumption that, we know the present, and what we have to study is the past. We live in the present, so we sort of know the present, but once you really see how strange the present is and how we really don't understand where we are located, and the sense of, to use Arendt's language, worldlessness, lack of orientation, and the rest, then you have to start thinking about, okay, the uses of the past. I mean, Nietzsche was very big on this, and I think he was right. Like, what are the uses of the past for the present to enable us in the present to make, well, Arendt would say this, Nietzsche wouldn't say, well, Nietzsche would say to make action possible in the present. He didn't think about in the political terms necessarily, but to make political action in the present possible. So the question of, I think, history really matters. And I think feminist historiography is incredibly important. It's important, though, we have to think about what would be an alternative form. It's not just the critique of the progress narrative, but what are alternative forms of feminist historiography that are enabling for action in the present, that help us make sense of where we are now. And that's this notion that, I'm taking. I mean, I'm not the only person taking this. There are several people who have talked about Benjamin in this connection, including, of course, Hannah Arendt, this idea of pearl diving, of finding, of working with a fragmentary history, as Shayla Ben-Habib has put it, and thinking about history in those terms. So it's a question of like, what can and should feminist historiography be now, if its aim is to enable political action in the present?
I wonder if this is correct, and correct me if I'm wrong. Am I correct to understand your earlier work on feminism as more concerned with action, just like in Arendt's papers, earlier papers, and the later work with contemplation, which obviously Hannah Arendt asserts is a form of action, but it has this more contemplative dimension. So I wonder if that's true of your own papers as well, that the feminist papers are more activist, or are more about real life engagement and how to reconstruct and understand our actions. And the later paper that we can move on perhaps to in a moment is more about reflection and about capacity to understand. Is that correct, or would you challenge this?
I guess I'd want to dispute that, only because, I mean, I know we'll talk more about Arendt on thinking, but one of the arguments that I've tried to make about Arendt, I think throughout most of my work, is that even when she turns to the so-called life of the mind, it is from the perspective of the world and care for the world, and it's not a retreat from the world. Thinking matters to the extent that it enables us to face reality. And so I don't see Arendt, I've never accepted this kind of bifurcation of Arendt into the person who was concerned with the vita activa and politics, and then the later Arendt who goes back into her little philosophical cave, because after all, she was trained by Jaspers and Heidegger and, and all of that. I've never accepted that. I've always seen her as trying to do to the vita contemplativa exactly what she does to the vita activa, which is like to make visible its importance for care for the world, which is all, what matters for her, right? And to, overcome, or not overcome, I don't know if there's any overcoming here, but ways to grapple with this state in which we find ourselves of worldlessness, world alienation, and the rest. So
there are so many things to touch upon. I'm not sure if which one to begin.
I'm just mesmerized. But it's interesting what you just said, because one of the quotes, and I was just pulling it back on screen, one of the quotes that I highlighted while reading your paper, the paper on Arendt, was thinking has intentional features, which is just to say that thinking is directed at or towards something in the world. Whenever one thinks about something, one thinks about it in relation to a certain context and in a meaningful way. And this really reminded me of the work that you've done on judging. We are both with Emilia, of course, Emilia, you're more from a philosophical background. I study very much legal theory. And it's really, what really piqued my interest there is that thinking seems to be a very contextual practice, very much in the same way that judging is a contextual practice. And where we go wrong is we either stop thinking, because, and when you can talk about this idea of faultlessness as opposed to stupidity perhaps later, but it's also that we, and I think in certain rule-based modes of reasoning, it's very easy to forget the importance of a context.
Yeah, I fully agree with that. And, I think Arendt understood that. The Wittgenstein in me, thinks that it's always context-based. And so intentionality, as you will know, is this philosophical term taken from the phenomenological tradition, which does mean that thought is directed to something in the world, even if that something, if you like, is, it's absent, right? This is an absent presence or something. I mean, you're trying to make something, but it's connected to the world. And I think recognizing that connection to the world in what appears to be the most worldless activity, thinking, where it's just me and myself, and it seems as if the whole world, and Arendt talks about this. I mean, if you read the life, I don't know if both of you are familiar with that text, but Volume 1, Life of the Mind. I mean, she's really talking about that sense of the world just disappears. And anyone who is engaged in a process of thinking has experienced that, when you're in, what do they call it? You're in the flow or whatever, like, well, I just call it the zone, and it's sort of everything just drops out and you're just there with these thoughts. But then it's like the question of why the thoughts in the first place, like how do they have a context, something makes them important for you. And reconstructing that connection to the world is very important.
I think in this work, she actually relies very heavily. Maybe I'm wrong, but I see more of a Husserlian phenomenological tradition in that work rather than Heideggerian influence, or combination of both. Because if Husserl advised to suspend any judgment in this kind of phenomenological epoche, that we just observe the world and we are there in the world, and suddenly we find ourselves in a stream of consciousness that is perhaps not judgmental, perhaps just simply is about being in the world. But then this element of what does it mean for my action? What does it mean for who I am as a human being? This is much more Arendtian, I think. I'm not sure if this is how you feel about Hannah Arendt's work, but I felt like this is one of the most Husserlian elements in her philosophy, in the sense that she kind of embraces more of a kind of phenomenological suspension as opposed to and adds her own ideas of action and her own ideas of making sense of it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that question of the phenomenological concept of thinking, that thinking, I mean, that's a whole, there's a literature that's sort of developing, or that has developed, around the phenomenology of thinking, which I'm sort of getting more familiar with. I think in terms of the relationship to Husserl, she, of course, Husserl's, his project really was one of, saving the possibility of knowledge, and Arendt, so you're right, I think the focus is really for her on the question of meaning. And that distinction that she draws in the first volume, in volume 1 of The Life of the Mind, between knowing and meaning, is quite important, because we tend to confuse those two for her. And really fundamentally, thinking is ultimately a search for meaning, which is why, in a way, she can read someone like Kant and say, okay, well, Kant doesn't just make room for faith. I mean, Kant actually makes room for thinking beyond knowing, right? I mean, we think about things that we just cannot know. I mean, and not just God, though. I mean, for Arendt, I think the really key thing is this, as I say in this paper, this like proliferation of thought objects, such that it's not just, the classic sort of philosophical objects of thinking, right? Including God, of course, but really very, ordinary things in the world that can become thought objects for us, and that then make thinking relevant to all citizens and to democratic activity.
I just wonder if we could try to take those ideas to the everyday ground a little bit more, and practice of law, perhaps, and political activity of any citizen. So democratic dimension of the thoughts which we just explored, because it might appear somewhat abstract to our audience. Why is it so important? Why searching for meaning in political life, in particular, is so important for ordinary citizen and for democracy, more broadly speaking?
Well, I think one reason it's very important is, Arendt has a whole discussion of the relationship of democratic public discourse to, or opinion, right, to truth. And so for her, really, democracies function through this exchange of opinion, the formation of opinion, which she takes to be, and she does take this from Kant, to be a public process. In other words, within liberalism, as she puts it, there's a tendency to think we already have our opinions and we have the right to then express them, right? That's how liberalism understands freedom of opinion. But for Arendt, following Kant, no, we only come to have opinions through their public exchange. That's how we form our opinions. So she's interested in this question of opinion formation. And opinion formation is fundamentally about meaning. It's not about truth. In other words, truth for her, there are, of course, the only truths that matter to her in the political realm are factual truths, and not logical truths, for example. And so, but the problem of truth for her is when we treat even factual truths as if they were, on the one hand, there's a danger of treating them as if they are just a matter of meaning. Oh, well, I meant this, but, and it's all just about my opinion in that really kind of diluted way, that we hear sometimes. And on the other hand, treating them as if they were just hard facts that nobody can dispute. Nobody can possibly find a different way of thinking about it. And they're almost treated then as kind of mathematical truths or logical truths with which there can be, there can be no dissent. And so for Arendt, I think the issue of meaning is connected up with what opinions really are. Opinions are really views of what we think this world should look like, what is in the shared world, what belongs to the common world, what do we have in common? These are questions of meaning, not of knowledge as such, right? So that's, I guess, not exactly, it was not like a short way of answering your question, but that's what
I wonder if that's, for example, evident in her concept of as if rights and the idea that human rights, unless they are realized in actual world, are empty concepts that are abstract and incapable of carrying any meaning. So I wonder if this is one example when she talks about immigration and about asylum seekers who are being told that in principle, yes, they have universal rights, but these rights have no real existence unless they are guaranteed by individual member states. So I wonder if that would be one example of grounding abstract ideas in Arendt's philosophy and trying to translate pure thinking into action and actuality, so to say. I'm not sure what's your thoughts on that.
I think the whole right, not to go totally off on the rights discussion, but the rights discussion in Arendt is very complex, and there's a lot of disagreement, I would say, among Arendt scholars, because for some, Arendt's argument is, yes, as you said, her critique of the so-called rights of man, the idea that rights are sort of, it's like a substance that inheres in us as human beings. As human beings, we just naturally have rights. And her point is that, the statelessness of the wars, the kind of mass statelessness of people shows that, you really are just a naked shivering, whatever sort of figure, as Burke put it, without any rights, if there are not states that, uphold your rights. And that has led, some people to think that Arendt's argument then is really about the importance of sovereign nation states. But of course, her critique is that the very thing that guarantees rights or seems to guarantee rights is also what violated rights, okay, which is the nation state. So like nations both secure, but also are the greatest violators of human rights. And that's where I think you have to push this whole thing back from the level of any kind. The only guarantor of human rights is us. We guarantee rights. We citizens guarantee them, right? I mean, in other words, to the extent that belonging to a political community cannot be reduced to membership in a nation state for her. I mean, it actually means we, those of us who interact with others as citizens, believe that we and they have rights, and we will, secure those rights, or we will do our best to guarantee those rights. And short of that, yes, laws and all that really matters, but that's not where Arendt's thought goes. It always goes to this kind of agreement and continual contestation as well among citizens about what it means to be in a political community together. I
suppose that's, sorry, Aleksandra, you wanted to say?
Oh, no, because I wanted to take us in a different direction. So if you do have a question.
I wanted to kind of take us into a different direction, but connected to it. Namely the idea of community and the idea of being together and at the same time being alienated as a citizen who is there to make their own responsible choices and to make their own responsible decisions, sometimes very daunting decisions. So this way, I just wanted to kind of navigate us to the second paper.
Sorry, I'm just laughing. I'm laughing because I had a very similar train of thought. So what I wanted to ask, about is the solitary aspect of thinking and how we connect it to the very collectivity for which we are responsible as humans.
Well, that's why I don't really. I mean, I think Arendt is sort of, walking a thin line, or sort of trying to thread the needle there on this notion of thinking, because her argument about thinking really is to show us, even though we think it is solitary, even when I'm alone, I'm not alone. There's always the two in one, and she has that whole discussion of Socrates and you're in dialogue with this other part of yourself. So to discover the two in one, even in the individual, even in the solitary individual, she's always trying to introduce plurality into spaces where we think it's not there. Well, there's just me. How could there be plurality? And that's not exactly plurality for her, because of course, plurality requires other people, but she's always trying to undo the illusion that we really are these solitary beings in some way, and thinking is taking place in the skull, and it's not connected up with the world, or it's not answerable to some other part of myself. So that concept, if I were to pull, besides freedom, the main concept from Arendt is plurality. Plurality is the key concept to understanding, I think, all of her thought. And even though it seems like such a simple concept, oh yeah, there's lots of people, there's lots of different ways of doing things, etc. It's very complex for Arendt. I mean, to really build a vision of politics and what it can be on not only an acknowledgement of plurality, but the plurality is the starting point, and it is what makes it's the reason for politics. There's a lot of contemporary political theory, for example, the work of Rawls, the work of Habermas, etc., which of course recognizes that liberal democratic societies are plural, right? I mean, there's plurality, there's different comprehensive doctrines, there's different ways of thinking, et cetera. But plurality is always a problem. It's both an achievement, but it's a problem. And then all these mechanisms have to be developed to manage it. That's not how Arendt thinks about plurality. You know, she thinks about politics as essentially the experience of plurality. And I don't know how I got off on the plurality track, but that's, I think, like a key difference in her just way of thinking about politics or thinking about what thinking is, et cetera. So always plurality is always where she starts.
It's also super inspirational, I think, for legal scholars, judges, lawmakers to think about the plurality of thought and plurality of values in other way than, as you said, just finding mechanisms to tame it. Because perhaps embracing conflict and embracing disagreement would bring us more rewards than necessarily trying to homogenize the entire society, or in the process of homogenizing, imposing certain, in fact, arbitrarily selected or arbitrarily elected values, which is also coincidentally something that we talked about before.
Yeah, that's what I was about to say, that can a judge ever afford the same comfort of thought, being contextual, recognizing various perspectives, if they have to hand in a judgment which is unequivocal and which is in favor on one party or another, and often okay, they can justify the judgment in a wider context, but they might have to make a clear decision. So the judge will not have the same, I suppose, comfort and space for recognizing plurality sometimes.
Would that apply to all professional thinkers, or as we call them? Because there's a certain almost childlike freedom to think that strikes me in Arendt's thought. That it's a very human activity and a very basic activity in a way that belongs to everybody. Everybody should be able to do it. But I think, or maybe it's just my intuition, that by, in a way, commercializing it, it turns into something slightly different, if that makes sense. So I wonder how that commercialization of, or turning thinking into a profession, actually affects the concept or the activity of thinking.
So I was going to ask you, what do you mean by its commercialization? So you mean the creation of a professional class of thinkers?
Yes. Mm-hmm. So it's not just the academia, but Emilia mentioned a judge. Judging effectively involves an awful lot of thinking. Lawyering involves an awful lot of thinking, but I sense there is a difference between what thinking is in Arendt's terms and what we consider thinking in those terms.
I think that's a really important point, because it is confusing. If you think about thinking in terms of knowledge, then yeah, we need a professional class of thinkers, right? I mean, these people have a lot of knowledge, and they're the ones who, are going to probably make the best decisions and all the rest. And it does lead to a highly technocratic sort of vision of governance, right? At all different levels of society. But if you think about it, which she explicitly does, in terms of meaning, then, and that meaning and the ability to think from the position of another, right? I mean, this idea of representative thinking. So when she talks about Eichmann, for example, as, Eichmann was not stupid. I mean, she doesn't think that Eichmann, it's a problem of knowledge. And that's a kind of startling claim in certain respects, because you can think of all the things he said would counted as, quote, knowledge, it was not knowledge at all. It was, Nazi propaganda, ideology. However, she doesn't go after him at that level. He couldn't think from the standpoint of another human being. He couldn't see the world from the standpoint of another human being. And that's more this practice of thinking. So being, quote, intelligent, or trained is not a condition of thinking for her. And I think that's so important. I mean, it seems trivial, but I really do think it's very important. And a lot of the debates around elitism today, are really focused on that in many respects, because I think people who feel that, well, there's this elite class who they just don't think I have anything, I have no say, like there's nothing because I don't know all these things. So it's a problem.
Yeah, the reframing of wrongdoing, as I think you describe it in your paper, as a failure of thinking in reference to Arendt rather than knowing. Mm-hmm. It really resonates when we think about the current problems that we face in a society of this huge disempowerment of vast groups in society. It's not even groups. I think the majority of people that I've encountered recently, there is this almost automatic deference to authority, just because, oh, the government might be failing, but they're trying their best, they know best. And it's really interesting to me, and probably to Emilia as well, coming from a post-communist republic, where there's this almost inherent mistrust in the authority, because you work on a presumption that the authorities, the communist authorities, didn't know anything. So it's harder for us, I think, to work on that assumption. And it's easier to also engage in the political discourse, because you can think for yourself, you should have an opinion. And it's very, I think, reshaping this debate in terms of, it does matter what you, it's not that it matters what you think, it matters that you think, rather than that could be a potential, solution to a lot of our problems in modern democracies.
Absolutely. And that was something that, Arendt was, if you read the, Between Past and Future, where she talks about these, 8 exercises in political thought. And she says explicitly, this is not about teaching people what to think, but how to think. Like, how to think is something very different. And I mean, to get back to the point you were making at the beginning, I'm constantly astonished at the extent to which we have sort of outsourced our lives, like every aspect of our lives. And, and I'm not just talking about now, you have your groceries delivered by Instacart and all the things that, people outsource. They get their dogs picked up to go to doggy care or whatever. I mean, I'm talking about like the outsourcing of even things like, the rise of all these coaches and all these people who like this incredible unsettling of people, making people feel, I know it sounds like a conspiracy. It's not that I think it's a conspiracy, but I think that there's, in all different levels of our society, you see this constant, sort of unsettling of your own confidence in your ability to, tie your own shoes. And then it becomes like you need somebody to do that for you. And there's this constant sort of creation of a need for an expert or somebody who's going to tell you. And with that, of course, it's not only, multi-billion-dollar industries are, born and sustained, but then a sense of our own, like one level irrelevance, well, what we don't have the cognitive competence to really have a say. But with that goes also a sense of anger or just resentment at being seen as someone has nothing to say. So I've been thinking about this a lot lately, and it's something that came to me initially through like feminist critiques of, for example, fashion magazines and all this stuff, which is all about making women feel insecure about, you thought you knew how to do your hair, but guess what? You don't, or you thought you knew how to do this, and sort of this constant creation of this insecurity so that you'll buy another product and whatever. But I think it's much broader than that. It's not just feminism, right? So
it would be a struggle now I think about it, because I think with activities such as lawmaking, it's very easy for people to feel very disempowered. And I wonder and again, this is a theme, I think it's becoming a theme in our conversations, Emilia, with multiple guests now, is that there's this idea that law is this thing on a cloud that we abide by, but we don't really get involved in. So this is a thing that lawyers do, or judges do, or lawmakers do. This is not a thing that normal people get involved in, unless, I don't know, you get a fine or you kill someone or you have one of those massive dramas in your life that you have to resolve, right? So divorces and other things. But how much better would our society be if we actually started thinking proactively about the law and thinking about simplifying it? Because in the end of the day, it is deciding a certain normative framework that we live by. And perhaps the same applies to the political life as well. That if we start encouraging people to participate in those debates, then I would struggle to see how our society wouldn't improve. And of course, at the very heart of it, it's a certain discourse and it's a certain debate, and we have to get perhaps more accustomed with caring and more accustomed with just arguing and being more comfortable with arguing and shaking hands at the end of it. But I worry that sometimes it becomes a dying art, and the idleness that you described is almost taking over our lives in a way that, we are having this conversation, the three of us, but it's becoming a certain dying thing where people just don't engage in thinking and talking about not just abstract terms, but things that really do affect us, just by saying that they don't have the expertise to do that.
I agree with you that is a real danger, and you can see it in many aspects of our society. But I mean, nobody's ever accused me of being too optimistic, but I do see, like today, I mean, for example, take the law issue. I mean, the debates over abolition, right? I mean, all of that, whatever you may think of it or them. And I think a lot of people have, I don't know, I know I have had, certain very narrow conception of what that even means, and, defund the police, that's it, et cetera. And that there's people are starting to rethink things like the law from the ground up. Well, what would it mean to think about law differently? Like the whole normative framework of law. What is the purpose of law? What do we want law to do for us? If it's not just about punishment. And I think like those questions are coming up now in a way that, they haven't in a long time. I mean, I'm not saying they haven't in the past, but there's, I'm kind of hopeful about that. I mean, probably my biggest worry right now is the loss of faith in the basic democratic process, which is why, like, the loss of faith in elections. And, I was just reading this survey about, what do Americans, and also they had a study of Europeans in different, European countries, what people thought were the most important aspects of, their society. And, what came out on top often was a fair judiciary, right? So the idea of equal treatment under the law, but then also fair elections. And interestingly, gender equality. So, but the idea of losing faith in the possibility of, for example, fair elections, which is what we have going on right now, and it's being stoked both by the Democrats and by the Republicans, is really worrisome, because I don't know where that then goes, so yeah. So those are my, I have worries, but I also have, a view of stuff doesn't work the way it was supposed to work. And I think the pandemic just created this chaos in people's lives that they had to step back and say, wow, how can we do this differently?
Emilia, before you jump in, I'm just going to say one positive thing to add to the pot. So the concept of smart contracts, where people contract with each other and it's there is a certain trend towards simplification and using technology for basic transactions. Is another area where I think private law might be slightly changing and coming in the right direction from the over formalization of things. But Emilia.
I'm just mindful of time that we've been obviously asking you for such a long time now. But one thing, perhaps a final question and an exercise in imagination. You did mention the pandemic. And of course, we did have a quick conversation about Hannah Arendt concept of solitude and being together. So I wonder what she would have made of pandemic and isolation and the idea that we all had to be solitary, isolated physically, let's say. Yet there are many examples throughout the pandemic where we came together very, very strongly. And the same goes for political action. I feel that internet did enable political participation to a greater extent than ever before, to some extent. And even if people are not deep thinkers, they engage and they express their opinions, and they trying to perhaps this could be polarizing to society as well. But there is, at least that's my sense, that, or my feeling, that the pandemic brought us to some extent together and made people more conscious of their impact on the shape of politics and political life more broadly. But that's just a guess, and my own guess of what Arendt would have made of the pandemic and that experience.
Well, I'm sure that's true for some people, no doubt. But and I'm not once again, I'm not an expert, now I'm just whatever, sort of violating my own rule here. But in any case, I'm much more worried, I guess, in the following way, that I think if you read how the experience of being on social media for I've been reading a lot for like these women, who are like single moms and all of this, who, it makes them feel lonelier. And I think that's fascinating. Like, why would it make them feel lonelier? I'm not really on social media, so I can't really say, but that really surprised me, in some way, but it makes them actually feel lonelier. And so there's an experience of loneliness that's connected with the use of social media that needs to be better understood. The other thing is, and this is probably my biggest worry here, is it's connected to my point earlier about the outsourcing of our lives, is I feel like the private realm is just getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And people are living in, pretty soon everyone's going to have like a moat around their homes or their apartments. And there's just no reason to leave home anymore. It's kind of like, why go to the movies? I'll just watch it on Netflix and why go? And the sense of, I don't know if any of you have even tried to go to stores or shopping or anything like that. It's like a desert. I mean, there's nobody there. And I'm not saying that, shopping malls are the place where, all this public activity is happening, but, normally you would see Americans out shopping and there's very little contact, and people have become more comfortable with living their lives within the private realm and the family unit. Now, I use that term loosely because, of course, families are lots of different things today. They're not what I grew up, thinking it's supposed to be. But nevertheless, that's something Arendt talks about a lot, and what happens when we start to think even about the nation state as like one big family. That's what happened in totalitarianism. I mean, just it's sort of, we all have one opinion, even though we may be quarreling with our partners, spouses, children, whatever. That's the worry to me. It's just, people don't want to go out anymore. They just don't. And maybe that's going to change now. that they're lifting all the regulations, but I'm sort of worried that folks have gotten really used to, I see it in myself as well. You know, it's like, oh, do I have to fly to Stockholm to give this talk? Can I just do it on Zoom? You know, well, yeah, but it's not like flying to Stockholm. So that's a real problem. I think it's a kind of an increase in our sense of worldlessness and lack of, and loneliness, you know. So, which does lead to forms of demagoguery. And the last point there, of course, is, I mean, I'm just saying something everybody already knows, but, you know, where do people go when they're going in social media? They're in echo chambers. That's why, you know, when folks are sort of this thing about, oh, there's too many opinions out there and we need to get, you know, all straight about what the facts are. I'm like, it's not that there are too many opinions. There are too few opinions. People are in these little groups with others who think exactly what they think, you know, and that is the bigger worry. Because for Arendt, you know, it was really about the exposure to people who have opinions that are different from mine, and that I'm confronted with them. I'm not confronted with anything when I'm sitting here at my computer. You know, I just go where I know everyone already agrees with me.
So perhaps what I said with people being more active on social media is really a facade of very superficial herd mentality that we see encouraged by the social media, whereby instead of having a genuine distinct opinion, people have just associate themselves with certain ideas in a very strict fashion, unable to revise their positions. And vaccines could be one example. So if you have anti-vaxxers, they will stick together blindly almost to being unwilling to revise their position, or maybe the opposite. I'm not sure, but there could be this trend which discourages independent thinking. And
but I wonder how much of that is actually detached from the concept of thinking that we talked about. So having an opinion in 21st century does not require thinking. I think we just we can go on the internet, steal a headline, and then profess it until we get bored, and then find. And I think the echo chambers are just longing for a connection and longing for belonging.
Absolutely.
That the pandemic really made way harder. Because when I look at my parents live in a very small town, and people know each other, and neighbors still know each other. And to me, it's almost odd, because when you live in a big city, you do get used to, maybe knowing one of your neighbors, but people don't really know each other that well. Or in the UK, and Emilia will agree with me, I'm almost certain, is that there is almost this superficiality of human connections, that when you come back home, and even if you don't have that because of the pandemic, then you automatically just seek this reassurance that, oh, there are other people like me, even if my opinion is artificial, maybe it's the most popular one. So my group is going to be the biggest one. But then all of this is obviously a conjecture of a non-expert sociologist. So
yeah, but I mean, I just think we have to be careful. Social media is a very complex network of relationships, et cetera. And there's a lot of good. There's a lot of political activity that comes out of that that's very good. So I don't want to portray it, in the sense of it just creates more alone, but it can. I mean, the idea that it's a panacea for, it's going to connect people all across the globe. And we've heard all this stuff before, right? This is how they sold it to us. So it's, one needs to really think about, to go back to, your point, Aleksandra, about, opinion form. I think it's about opinion formation. I mean, one of the things that strikes me when I teach is a student will say, for example, well, that's just my opinion. And I'm like, well, the point is to have an informed opinion. i.e. an opinion that you formed, okay, by hearing other opinions, not a sort of merely subjective position on something that no one can really question because it's merely subjective. It's like, I like red wine instead of white, you know? And so it's that sort of way of thinking about opinions is very anti-Arendtian. I mean, she wants us to think about opinions as things that are formed in not only opinions, but thinking itself. And this, you know, I'll say this is the last point, but this is another thing she takes from Kant, is the idea that thinking needs to be public. You know, you need to really think, you need to think in relation to others. Now, those others could be the imagined other. What is it like from that position, to see the world from that position? It doesn't have to actually be in the public square, although that would be nice. But the publicity that's required for thinking is enormously important. And I feel like I'm not sure that that's always operative in a lot of these chat spaces.
Emilia, would you like to?
Yeah, I just, I'm fascinated by especially the Arendtian aspect, which you highlighted, that we cannot perceive social media phenomena as being one way or another. So there is potential for a plurality of ways in which what we encounter in life can unfold into, so to say. So I think that this is something that made me think that maybe I was polarizing here when I was trying to picture a single correct interpretation of what social media and pandemic actually brought to our life. It brought in a plurality of possibilities, which we could explore and continue to explore again in plurality of different ways. So that's again just an observation, really.
It's putting the paper in action. That's what just happened.
Yeah. Well, that's fine. I mean, I wake up some days, I have exactly the same view that you started with there, you know, and it's just like, social media is the enemy, et cetera. And, but I don't think, you know, I mean, one shouldn't have a kind of like, I don't know, technological determinism or something, you know, sort of that, you know, the just social media by its very nature, you know. But at the same time, one shouldn't be, I don't know, kind of, what's the word, sort of Pollyannish about it either. It's there are structures of power that are defining the way in which we're interacting on social media and the kinds of things. I mean, you know, all the debates around Facebook and about ads and the way, you know, you're being targeted and all your information and all the, so like, it's not just like, well, you can do with it what you like. I mean, it's not that simple either. But I have to leave that to the people who really know something about this. But I do think that there is a, you know, well of loneliness, to use the phrase, that people are experiencing. And the sad thing is that they maybe are out of practice for, like, the things they would need to get out of that feeling of loneliness are things they have, skills they've lost, you know? And so who knows?
Excellent. Well, I think we can move on to our final 5 questions, because I was just looking at the time and I can't believe my own eyes. We got completely lost in the conversation. First question, who or what was your biggest inspiration in your career?
Well, I think that, I mean, from an academic perspective, I think studying with Zila Eisenstein was very important for me. The reason being that I really didn't come to, when I studied political theory or political science as an undergraduate, all we read was Marx, Luxembourg, the whole like Marxist tradition, the feminist tradition, Angela Davis. I mean, I could have told you all of that. I had all the books, I knew everything. And then when I went off to Berkeley, I was like, who's John Locke? I mean, it was sort of this, I didn't have the grounding, actually. I came to the canon through these radical thinkers. And so was always a very interesting entry into the canon for me, because the canon then seemed like a strange object. Like, why would you think about it that way? Why wouldn't you see the position of women? Why wouldn't you? And then the other person who was very important for me was Michael Rogan, who was at Berkeley and wrote, he did a lot of work in American politics, which I didn't do. But, he wrote books like, on Andrew Jackson and, the extermination of the American Indian. He wrote a book, Ronald Reagan, the movie. He wrote books on Melville. And he was a very psychoanalytic thinker, but also a leftist who kind of did this interesting, sort of combination and just modeled what it means to be an intellectual for me. I mean, in a way, modeled it at the level of just watching him think was just this experience, you never felt, oh yeah, I know the next sentence that's going to come out of his mouth. It was just this experience of watching someone think. And so that modeling of what it means to be a professor, I think was formative, for me. It's an aspiration. I'm not even close to what he was like, but aspiration.
What do you wish you could tell your graduate student self?
I think, both a combination of relax and, that you have to trust, I say instincts, but you have to trust what are you really interested in, and really follow that. Because I mean, one of the things that I would have told my graduate self, or the thing I tell my graduate students today, which is just remember, you have to wake up to your dissertation every day. And then your dissertation is going to become your book, and you're going to wake up to it then. So make sure that you are working on things you're passionate about, and I think that becomes harder and harder over time as, the whole profession becomes, and graduate school itself becomes much more instrumentalized and, professionalized. But because I know, like, sometimes as a graduate student, I felt like I should be learning this, I should be doing that, I should be, I'll never get a job, and in the end, I just went ahead and wrote a book on feminism, and I was really happy doing it, and I did get a job, so it sort of worked out.
If you could only read one book for the rest of your life, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a really hard question. I mean, and I don't even know how to answer, because I think my answer, which is going to sound like, wow, what a depressed person, is, I would read Origins of Totalitarianism by Hannah Arendt, but that's because I think that book contains so much. It's not just this history, but the perils and dangers of ideological thinking and of the lack of plurality, and the collapse of the public realm, et cetera. I mean, I just find that book amazing. I've read it many, many times, and each time I'm like, have I read this before? Because it just strikes me as new. So,
and it's so well written too. It's an easy read in comparison to a lot of academic texts. If you had not been an academic, what alternative career would you have chosen?
Well, this is going to sound, whatever. I would have liked to have been a sommelier, actually. I would have, I love wine and I love I always thought of, I should have gotten trained as a sommelier, or at least done it on the side or something. Not that I'm this big expert, I'm not, but just I had this interest in it because of it's alive in some way. Like I always find this thing about, you buy this bottle, let's say you buy 3 bottles, you open one in a year, it tastes a certain way, you open another one a year after that, could taste vastly different. It's like this thing of, and it is for me besides food, the thing that brings people together at the table, to use Arendt's, metaphor, that is, it's meant to be shared. And so, yeah, I would have loved to have done that.
Perfect.
Probably be unemployed. But,
And the final question, finish this sentence. One thing no one talks about in academia is?
I think what people don't talk about is that everybody is basically walking around feeling quite insecure about their work and, the value of their work. And everyone is this sense of having to always be engaged in a form of posturing, like, well, I know what I'm doing. I know what I'm writing on. I know what I think recognizing that everybody always feels like they're on a job interview, even when they have the job, is not just a projection on my part. I think it's actually true of most academics, which is why I think that they end up in a kind of permanent state of sibling rivalry, which is quite destructive. And the other thing is that nobody really talks about the importance of gratitude, just gratitude for those who came before you, those who taught you, those who helped you, moved you along, etc. I think gratitude is incredibly important, and it's very important in feminism. So, yeah.
Oh, we could have an entire episode on gratitude in feminism, but I don't think we should continue the discussion right now. Emilia, would you like to?
We're definitely incredibly grateful for your contribution to our podcast. It was absolutely fascinating to discuss Hannah Arendt's ideas and also look at broader influences that shaped your own scholarship. We thank you very
much. We hope to see you in Chicago at some point, or if you're ever down in London, please do give us a shout.
Absolutely. I would love to reconnect with you too. This was a great experience. It was really fun talking with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you so
very much. Hi, it's Aleksandra here. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. If you like our project, have any questions, or would like to recommend a guest or a topic, drop us a line on just.theory.project@gmail.com. This season was made possible with the generous funding of Newcastle University. If you like, you can buy us a coffee. Your support will enable us to continue our work. Just Theory, changing the face of legal theory.